Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our second read in Book 5, Chapter 1, Part 2. Chapter 1 entitled, Of the Expenses of the Sovereign or Commonwealth, and Part 3 entitled, Of the Expense of Public Works and Public Institutions. Part 3 is then subdivided into several articles. We are in the second half of Article 1, which is entitled, Of the Public Works and Institutions which are necessary for facilitating particular branches of commerce. So without further ado, the object of the public works and institutions above mentioned is to facilitate commerce in general. But in order to facilitate some particular branches of it, particular institutions are necessary, which again require a particular and extraordinary expense. Some particular branches of commerce, which are carried on with barbarous and uncivilized nations, require extraordinary protection. An ordinary store or counting house could give little security to the goods of the merchants who trade to the western coast of Africa. To defend them from the barbarous natives, it is necessary that the place where they are deposited should be, in some measure, fortified. The disorders in the government of Indostan have been supposed to render a like precaution necessary even among that mild and gentle people. And it was under pretense of securing their persons and property from violence that both the English and the French East India Companies were allowed to erect the first forts which they possessed in that country. Among other nations, whose vigorous government will suffer no strangers to possess any fortified place within their territory, it may be necessary to maintain some ambassador, minister, or consul, who may both decide, according to their own customs, the differences arising among his own countrymen, and, in their disputes with the natives, may, by means of his public character, interfere with more authority and afford them a more powerful protection than they could expect from any private man. The interests of commerce have frequently made it necessary to maintain ministers in foreign countries, where the purposes either of war or alliance would not have required any. The commerce of the Turkey Company first occasioned the establishment of an ordinary ambassador at Constantinople. The first English embassies to Russia arose altogether from commercial interests. The constant interference which those interests necessarily occasioned between the subjects of the different states of Europe has probably introduced the custom of keeping, in all neighboring countries, ambassadors or ministers constantly resident even in the time of peace. This custom, unknown to ancient times, seems not to be older than the end of the 15th or beginning of the 16th century, that is, than the time when commerce first began to extend itself to the greater part of the nations of Europe, and when they first began to attend to its interests. It seems not unreasonable that the extraordinary expense which the protection of any particular branch of commerce may occasion should be defrayed by a moderate tax upon that particular branch, by a moderate fine, for example, to be paid by the traders when they first enter into it, or, what is more equal, by a particular duty of so much per cent upon the goods which they either import into, or export out of, the particular countries with which it is carried on. The protection of trade in general, from pirates and freebooters, is said to have given occasion to the first institution of the duties of customs. But, if it was thought reasonable to lay a general tax upon trade in order to defray the expense of protecting trade in general, it should seem equally reasonable to pay a particular tax upon a particular branch of trade in order to defray the extraordinary expense of protecting that branch. The protection of trade in general has always been considered as essential to the defense of the Commonwealth, and, upon that account, a necessary part of the duty of the executive power. The collection and application of the general duties of customs, therefore, have always been left to that power. But the protection of any particular branch of trade is a part of the general protection of trade, a part, therefore, of the duty of that power, and if nations always acted consistently, the particular duties levied for the purposes of such particular protection should always have been left equally to its disposal. But in this respect, as well as in many others, nations have not always acted consistently, and in the greater part of the commercial states of Europe, particular companies of merchants had the address to persuade the legislature to entrust them the performance of this part of the duty of the sovereign, together with all the powers which are necessarily connected with it. These companies, though they may, perhaps, have been useful for the first introduction of some branches of commerce by making, at their own expense, an experiment which the state might not think it prudent to make, have in the long run proved, universally, either burdensome or useless, and have either mismanaged or confined the trade. When those companies do not trade upon a joint stock, but are obliged to admit any person, properly qualified, upon paying a certain fine, and agreeing to submit to the regulations of the company, each member trading upon his own stock and at his own risk, they are called regulated companies. When they trade upon a joint stock, each member sharing in the common profit or loss in proportion to his share in this stock, they are called joint stock companies. Such companies, whether regulated or joint stock, sometimes have and sometimes have not exclusive privileges. Regulated companies resemble, in every respect, the corporations of trades so common in the cities and towns of all the different countries of Europe, and are a sort of enlarged monopolies of the same kind. As no inhabitant of a town can exercise an incorporated trade without first obtaining his freedom in the corporation, so in most cases no subject of the state can lawfully carry on any branch of foreign trade for which a regulated company is established without first becoming a member of that company. The monopoly is more or less strict according as the terms of admission are more or less difficult, and according as the directors of the company have more or less authority, or have it more or less in their power to manage in such a manner as to confine the greater part of the trade to themselves and their particular friends. In the most ancient regulated companies, the privileges of apprenticeship were the same as in other corporations, and entitled the person who had served his time to a member of the company to become himself a member, either without paying any fine, or upon paying a much smaller one than what was exacted of other people. The usual corporation spirit, wherever the law does not restrain it, prevails in all regulated companies. When they have been allowed to act according to their natural genius, they have always, in order to confine the competition to as small a number of persons as possible, endeavored to subject the trade to many burdensome regulations. When the law has restrained them from doing this, they have become altogether useless and insignificant. The regulated companies for foreign commerce, which at present subsist in Great Britain, are the Ancient Merchant and Adventurers Company, now commonly called the Hamburg Company, the Russia Company, the Eastland Company, the Turkey Company, and the African Company. The terms of admission into the Hamburg Company are now said to be quite easy, and the directors either have it not in their power to subject the trade to any burdensome restraint or regulations, or, at least, have not of late exercised that power. It has not always been so. About the middle of the last century, the fine for admission was 50 and at one time 100 pounds, and the conduct of the company was said to be extremely oppressive. In 1643, in 1645, and in 1661, the clothiers and free traders of the west of England complained of them to Parliament as of monopolists who confined the trade and oppressed the manufacturers of that country. Though those complaints produced no act of Parliament, they had probably intimidated the company so far as to oblige them to reform their conduct. Since that time, at least, there have been no complaints against them. By the 10th and 11th of William III, chapter 6, the fine for admission into the Russian company was reduced to £5, and by the 25th of Charles, c. 7, that for admission into the Eastland Company to 40 shillings, while at the same time Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, all the countries on the north side of the Baltic, were exempted from their exclusive charter. The conduct of those companies had probably given occasion to those two acts of Parliament. Before that time, Sir Josiah Child had represented both these and the Hamburg Company as extremely oppressive, and imputed to their bad management the low state of the trade, which we at that time carried on to the countries comprehended within their respective charters. But though such companies may not, in the present times, be very oppressive, they are certainly altogether useless. To be merely useless, indeed, is perhaps the highest eulogy which can ever justly be bestowed upon a regulated company, and all the three companies above mentioned seem, in their present state to deserve this eulogy. The fine for admission into the Turkey Company was formerly £25 for all persons under 26 years of age and £50 for all persons above that age. Nobody but mere merchants could be admitted, a restriction which included all shopkeepers and retailers. By a bylaw, no British manufacturers could be exported to Turkey but in the general ships of the company. And as those ships sailed always from the port of London, this restriction confined the trade to that expensive port, and the traders to those who lived in London and in its neighborhood. By another bylaw, no person living within 20 miles of London, and not free of the city, could be admitted a member. Another restriction, which joined to the foregoing, necessarily excluded all but the free men of London. As the time for the loading and sailing of those general ships depended altogether upon the directors, they could easily fill them with their own goods and those of their particular friends, to the exclusion of others who, they might pretend, had made their proposals too late. In this state of things, therefore, this company was in every respect a strict and oppressive monopoly. Those abuses gave occasion to the second act of the 26th of George II, chapter 18, reducing the fine for admission to £20 for all persons, without any distinction of ages, or any restriction either to mere merchants or to the freemen of London, and granting to all such persons the liberty of exporting from all the ports of Great Britain to any port in Turkey all British goods of which the exportation was not prohibited, and of importing from thence all Turkish goods, of which the importation was not prohibited, upon paying both the general duties of customs and the particular duties assessed for defraying the necessary expenses of the company, and submitting, at the same time, to the lawful authority of the British ambassador and consuls resident in Turkey, and to the bylaws of the company duly enacted. To prevent any oppression by those bylaws, it was by the same act ordained that if any 7 members of the company conceive themselves aggrieved by any bylaw which should be enacted after the passing of this act, they might appeal to the Board of Trade and Plantations, to the authority of which a committee of the Privy Council was now succeeded, provided such appeal was brought within 12 months after the bylaw was enacted, and that if any 7 members conceive themselves aggrieved by any bylaw which had been enacted before the passing of this act, they might bring a like appeal, provided it was within 12 months after the day on which this act was to take place. The experience of 1 year, however, may not always be sufficient to discover to all the members of a great company the pernicious tendencies of a particular bylaw, and if several of them should afterwards discover it, neither the Board of Trade nor the Committee of Council can afford them any redress. The object, besides, of the greater part of the bylaws of all regulated companies, as well as all other corporations, is not so much to oppress those who are already members as to discourage others from becoming so, which may be done not only by a high fine, but by many other contrivances. The constant view of such companies is always to raise the rate of their own profit as high as they can, to keep the market, both for the goods which they export and for those which they import, as much understocked as they can, which can be done only by restraining the competition or by discouraging new adventurers from entering into the trade. A fine even of £20, besides, though it may not, perhaps, be sufficient to discourage any man from entering into the Turkey trade with an intention to continue in it, may be enough to discourage a speculative merchant from hazarding a single adventure in it. In all trades, the regular established traders, even though not incorporated, naturally combine to raise profits, which are no way so likely to be kept at all times, down to their proper level as by the occasional competition of speculative adventurers. The Turkey trade, though in some measure laid upon by this Act of Parliament, is still considered by many people as very far from being altogether free. The Turkey Company contribute to maintain an ambassador and 2 or 3 consuls, who, like other public ministers, ought to be maintained altogether by the state, and the trade laid laid open to all his Majesty's subject. The different taxes levied by the company for this and other corporation purposes might afford a revenue much more than sufficient to enable the state to maintain such ministers. Regulated companies, it was observed by Sir Josiah Child, though they had frequently supported public ministers, had never maintained any forts or garrisons in the countries to which they traded, whereas joint stock companies frequently had. And in reality, the former seemed to be much more unfit for this sort of service than the latter. First, the directors of a regulated company have no particular interest in the prosperity of the general trade of the company, for the sake of which such forts and garrisons are maintained. The decay of that general trade may even frequently contribute to the advantage of their own private trade, as by diminishing the number of their competitors, it may enable them both to buy cheaper and to sell dearer. The director of a joint stock company, on the contrary, having only their share in the profits which are made upon the common stock committed to their management, have no private trade of their own, of which the interest can be separated from that of the general trade of the company. The private interest is connected with the prosperity of the general trade of the company, and with the maintenance of the forts and garrisons which are necessary for its defense. They are more likely, therefore, to have that continual and careful attention which that maintenance necessarily requires. Secondly, the directors of a joint stock company have always the management of a large capital, the joint stock of the company, a part of which they may frequently employ, with propriety, in building, repairing, and maintaining such necessary forts and garrisons. But the directors of a related company, having the management of no common capital, have no other fund to employ in this way but the casual revenue arising from the admission fines, and from the corporation duties imposed upon the trade of the company. Though they have the same interest, therefore, to attend to the maintenance of such forts and garrisons, they can seldom have the same ability to render that attention effectual. The maintenance of a public minister requiring scarce any attention, and but a moderate and limited expense, is a business much more suitable both to the temper and abilities of a regulated company. Long after the time of Sir Josiah Child, however, in 1750, a regulated company was established, the present Company of Merchants Trading to Africa, which was expressly charged at first with the maintenance of all the British forts and garrisons that lie between Cape Blanc and the Cape of Good Hope, and afterwards with that of those only which lie between Cape Rouge and the Cape of Good Hope. The act which establishes this company, the 23rd of George II, chapter 31, which seems to have had two distinct objects in view. First, to restrain effectually the oppressive and monopolizing spirit which is natural to the directors of a regulated company, and secondly, to force them, as much as possible, to give an attention which is not natural to them, towards the maintenance of forts and garrisons. For the first of these purposes, the fine for admission is limited to 40 shillings. The company is prohibited from trading in their corporate capacity or upon a joint stock, from borrowing money upon common seal, or from laying any restraints upon the trade which may be carried on freely by all places, and by all persons being British subjects, and paying the fine. The government is in a committee of 9 persons who meet at London, but are chosen annually by the freemen of the company at London, Bristol, and Liverpool, 3 from each place. No committeeman can be continued in office for more than 3 years together. Any committeeman might be removed by the Board of Trade and Plantations, now by a committee of council after being heard in his own defense. The committee are forbid to export Negroes from Africa or to import any African goods into Great Britain. But as they are charged with the maintenance of forts and garrisons, they may, for that purpose, export from Great Britain to Africa goods and stores of different kinds. Out of the moneys which they shall receive from the company, they are allowed a sum not exceeding £800 for the salaries of their clerks and agents at London, Bristol, and Liverpool, the house rent of their offices at London, and all other expenses of management, commission, and agency in England. What remains of this sum, after defraying these different expenses, they may divide among themselves as compensation for their trouble in what manner they think proper. By this constitution, it might have been expected that the spirit of monopoly would have been effectually restrained, and the first of these purposes sufficiently answered. It would seem, however, that it had not. Though by the 4th of George III, chapter 20, the fort of Senegal, with all its dependencies, had been vested in the company of merchants trading to Africa, yet in the year following, by the 5th of George III, chapter 44, not only Senegal, but its dependencies, but the whole coast from the port of Salé in South Barbary to Cape Rouge was exempted from the jurisdiction of that company, was vested in the crown, and the trade to it declared free to all his majesty's subjects. The company had been suspected of restraining the trade and of establishing some sort of improper monopoly. It is not, however, very easy to conceive how, under the regulations of 23rd George II, they could do so. In the printed debates of the House of Commons, not always the most authentic records of truth, I observe, however, that they have been accused of this. The members of the Committee of Nine being all merchants, and the governors and factors in their different forts and settlements being all dependent upon them, it is not unlikely that the latter might have given peculiar attention to the consignments and commissions of the former, which would establish a real monopoly. For the second of these purposes, the maintenance of the forts and garrisons, an annual sum has been allotted to them by Parliament, generally about £13,000. For the proper application of this sum, the committee is obliged to account annually to the Cursitor Baron of Exchequer, which account is afterwards to be laid before Parliament. But Parliament, which gives so little attention to the application of millions, is not likely to give much to that of £13,000 a year, and the Cursitor Baron of Exchequer, from his profession and education, is not likely to be profoundly skilled in the proper expense of forts and garrisons. The captains of His Majesty's Navy, indeed, or any other commissioned officers appointed to the Board of Admiralty, may inquire into the condition of the forts and garrisons and report their observations to that board. But that board seems to have no direct jurisdiction over the committee, nor any authority to correct those who conduct it may thus inquire into. And the captains of His Majesty's Navy, besides, are not supposed to be always deeply learned in the science of fortification. Removal from an office, which can be enjoyed only for the term of 3 years, and of which the lawful emoluments, even during that term, are so very small, seems to be the utmost punishment to which any committeeman is liable for any fault except direct malversation or embezzlement either of the public money or of that of the company, and the fear of that punishment can never be a motive of sufficient weight to force a continual and careful attention to a business to which he has no other interest to attend. The committee are accused of having sent out bricks and stones from England for the reparation of Cape Coast Castle on the coast of Guinea, a business for which Parliament had several times granted an extraordinary sum of money. These bricks and stones, too, which had thus been sent upon so long a voyage, were said to have been of so bad a quality that it was necessary to rebuild them from the foundation walls which had been repaired with them. The forts and garrisons which lie north of Cape Rouge are not only maintained at the expense of the state, but are under the immediate government of the executive power, and why those which lie south of that cape, and which too are, in part at least, maintained at the expense of the state, should be under a different government, it seems not very easy even to imagine a good reason. The protection of the Mediterranean trade was the original purpose or pretense of the garrisons of Gibraltar and Minorca, and the maintenance and government of those garrisons has always been, very properly, committed not to the Turkey Company, but to the executive power. In the extent of its dominion consists, in a great measure, the pride and dignity of that power, and it is not very likely to fail in attention to what is necessary for the defense of that dominion. The garrisons at Gibraltar and Minorca, accordingly, have never been neglected, though Minorca has been twice taken, and is now probably lost forever. That disaster was never even imputed to any neglect in the executive power. I would not, however, be understood to insinuate that either of those expensive garrisons was ever, even in the smallest degree, necessary for the purpose for which they are originally dismembered from the Spanish monarchy. That dismemberment, perhaps, never served any real purpose than to alienate from England her natural ally, the King of Spain, and to unite the two principal branches of the House of Bourbon in a much stricter and more permanent alliance than the ties of blood could ever have united them. Joint stock companies, established either by royal charter or by the Act of Parliament, differ in several respects not only from regulated companies, but from private partneries. And so before we dive into that, we are just about out of time, so that seems like a good stopping point. So we will continue in our reading with Chapter 1, Book 5, Chapter 1, Part 3 in our next read. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.